One of the most striking things of the past 12 months has been the extent to which and scale to which so many of the population of Ireland and the broader planet doesn't understand how society works. That is because they've been listening to too much mainstream media, despite the fact that the mainstream media has largely disgraced itself, particularly in Ireland over the past year. Every single society is divided into the high, the middle, and the low. Now, a society might be a local community, it might be a city, it might be a county, a country, a province, a state, but ultimately the biggest community is the planet itself. And anybody who believes that the high have an altruistic attitude to those below them is not reading the story correctly. And anybody who believes that the high will allow anything to get in the way of them, particularly if they think that there is a credible threat to them, is again not reading the story accurately. You see this with class distinctions. And it was actually very well described in 1984 by George Orwell, where the middle class is persecuted primarily by the high, but also to a certain extent by the low. So in 1984, and it's not made much of in the novel, George Orwell doesn't give very much away in the novel, the high absolutely ruthlessly persecutes the middle class and takes an indifferent attitude to the low. The low class actually live quite freely, although they live quite impoverished circumstances. But so long as they're not a threat to the high, they're left alone. You see this with planning, and you see this with litigation. And people in private circumstances, well, just take it in an Irish context, but in fact you can apply it globally. People who litigate in private circumstances in relation particularly to planning matters aren't doing that altruistically. They're doing it because they think something is going to threaten them. Their income, their environment, their quality of life, or whatever. Do not ever imagine that they will tolerate for 1 second anybody getting in the way of what they plan to do. They will not. They will take any measure that they think they can to eliminate any threat to them, either overall or in an interim way if somebody is interfering with their efforts to protect themselves. The high will not tolerate the middle class getting in the slightest bit above themselves or in any way stepping on the toes of the high. That is probably one of the most incontrovertible laws of human life. It goes beyond human life as well. The people who actually call the shots in any of these situations are very rarely, if ever, the ones that you see in the mainstream media. It's practically contrary to the situation that you'd see their names in the mainstream media. It's practically contrary to it. But the ones who call the shots, they're not going to be democratic about it or particularly altruistic about it either. They're going to call the shots because they're going to. And that's just the way that it is. And as I said, they will not tolerate anybody getting ideas above themselves or meddling or interfering or playing games with them. We are seeing this now. We see it in Ireland with planning and with litigation. We're seeing it, I suspect, at a global level because there seems to be, and I'm not necessarily standing over the reports that are coming out at the moment, but there seems to have been an asteroid that came perilously close to planet Earth about 48 hours ago. We're now on Monday morning here in Ireland. So around about Friday just gone out, there appears to have been an asteroid that came close to the planet. There were 2 factors with this asteroid: proximity and size. So the atmosphere of Earth burns up all kinds of alien objects that come in on a daily basis. That's what the atmosphere is there for. That's what it does. So these things come down from outer space or come from the solar system. Rocks and bits and pieces come down and they vanish into the atmosphere and they're burnt up. But it appears, and again, I'm not entirely standing over the sources at this stage. I need to look a bit closer myself, and don't imagine that the mainstream media will help in any way because they won't. But it seems that something came close to planet Earth around Friday just gone out. That it was much bigger than usual and much closer than usual, approximately 26,000 kilometres away. In context, we must see the diameter of the Earth is about 13,000 kilometres. So this would have been 3 times away from planet Earth, coming towards us, and of an unprecedentedly large size. Now, that, of course, would, based on those terms that I've just described, be a major threat to the planet. So whatever about global warming or climate change or any of this rubbish, if that thing had hit the planet, I wouldn't be here now. If that thing had come within 5,000 kilometres of the planet, I'd have no electricity now. Whether I'd be here now or not is a different thing. But if you have a threat like that, then one of the most important things that the people who are calling the shots have to deal with is the perception of the populace of the planet. So their first priority would be to avoid panic setting in. Because when a panic sets in, then you have looting, you have widespread crime, you have widespread violence, you have all kinds of stuff that you don't need. So how do you deal with that? How do you get a situation where that can be avoided? Well, what you do is you make sure that the people have been groomed into a situation where they're largely staying at home and largely just taking arbitrary orders. Does that sound familiar? So you get them to wear masks, not for the sake of health or anything, because the people who are calling the shots do not care, and that's putting it mildly, very mildly. They do not care about the health of the population of the planet. In my opinion, the people calling the shots would be much more obliged if 90% of the planet just died and weren't so inconvenient, because they perceive the planet as overpopulated anyway. So don't imagine that they're operating altruistically. They're not. Take my word for it. They're not. But if we want to get back to a cliche we've been hearing for the past year, we're all in this together. Well, if an asteroid 3/4 the size of Earth hits us, yes, then we are indeed all in this together. Doesn't matter who you are, we're all in this together. My mother and I made an observation from last Wednesday that we did not hear any planes coming in or out of Dublin Airport, and we're in the flight path of Dublin Airport. The sea is behind our house. They go right over the sea. There's nothing interrupting the planes and our house. I may be wrong. There may have been some aircraft in and out of Dublin Airport, but we heard nothing. It was unprecedentedly quiet. It reminded us of Christmas Day when Dublin Airport closes, being one of the few major airports in the world to actually close at Christmas. Dublin Airport actually doesn't have any flights in and out between the 24th and 26th of December. It's lovely. There's no flights. It's beautifully quiet. It was just like that. But we noticed it particularly from Wednesday up to today. The media were objecting, and people, the alternative voices and the media were objecting to the fact that in the 10 days before then, there were guarded checkpoints around the airport. They weren't allowing people to fly. They were closing down flights. Nobody was getting in or out of the country. They were saying that this was an attack upon our civil liberties and all of that. But don't think that the people at a global level who are running this planet care about your civil liberties, because they don't. I believe that at a top secret, highest military level, a decision was made to respond to this particular threat that appears to have been coming close to planet Earth. I believe that they were aware of it from some time back, and that they were aware of the need, first of all, from a military point of view, to be ready for it, and secondly, from a group psychological point of view, to manage the masses as well as they could, so that they wouldn't be pesky, and also that they wouldn't wreck the place and steal from the people who are in charge. I believe that it is possible that from Wednesday just gone out up to about today, there was a secret order given that all civilian aircraft were to be grounded. And there is a reason for that. If this thing was coming close to planet Earth, they didn't know what it would do next. There was the distinct risk, and I'm not very au fait with these things, but there was the distinct risk from my layman's point of view that if this thing came particularly close, it could be pulled into Earth's gravitational field. If that had happened, we would have been in big trouble. I believe that there was an order to ground all civilian aircraft because I believe it is possible that the early warning systems of the big powers, being Russia, America, China, and also relying on the expertise of Israel, were preparing for the possibility, or at least keeping the options open, of launching a nuclear strike. America has 6,000 live, ready-to-launch nuclear arms. They have kept those for a reason. And it's not to nuke Moscow. One must always be prepared for things like what may have happened over the past 4 or 5 days. And I see the credible possibility that there was a global lockdown, and over this particular 4 to 5 days, a pause put on civilian flights. Now, I may be wrong. To enable the possibility of launching nuclear rockets that wouldn't be impeded by civilian aircraft. I don't know, but I may be wrong. I'm only speaking, by the way, from a Dublin point of view because, as I said, I didn't hear any flights out of Dublin Airport for the past 3 to 4 days until today. There's a lot of flights coming in now. Ireland is not in NATO. We are not a nuclear power. They don't care. If they thought Ireland was going to in any way get in the way, or any civilian flight from Ireland might get in the way of what they were preparing for, they would shoot it down in 2 seconds. Maybe there were flights going in and out of Heathrow. Maybe there were flights going in and out of airports in Western Europe. But don't forget the strategic position of Ireland to the far west of the European Union. So I believe possibly that the lockdown on COVID-19, which is only a flu, we haven't seen them dying in the streets, and was invented by China anyway, was done by the Chinese to begin to groom a global population to stay at home in a critical period, to be ready to take military orders if given so, including don't go near Dublin Airport or you'll be arrested, and to be prepared for this particular 4 to 5 day period, which, if it seems to be the way that it seems, was exceedingly critical. So we are all in this together. We are all in this together. Don't be giving the globalists a big round of applause for their altruism. They just don't want themselves to be killed. If an asteroid had hit planet Earth, goodbye, we wouldn't be talking now. If it had come within the 5,000 kilometre range of Earth's general atmosphere, then the electromagnetic pulse of that would have been catastrophic. It would have almost been an equivalent of hitting Earth. Almost. Many people would have survived. We might have got rid of that pesky 90% that they don't want around anyway, so who knows. But at the same time, that would have been catastrophic. I believe that if this asteroid had begun to in any way veer towards Earth, they would have pressed the buttons immediately and got rid of it. They have very sophisticated systems for viewing these kind of things. They knew this was coming. And they knew this was coming at this time. Many people were talking about it and saying that early 2021 would be critical from an asteroid or astronomical perspective. Well, it seems that it was. But it also seems that this thing has now passed. Now, my prediction is that they will begin a slow easing off of lockdowns, COVID-19 things, and all the rest of it from this point onwards. We're even seeing a sunnier tone in the media today. Don't imagine that the mainstream media, particularly in a little peripheral country like Ireland, were even kept in on this plot. They wouldn't be. I know how these things work. When you're dealing, as I said, with planning litigation or that kind of thing, nobody's told what's going on. Lots happens behind the scene. Deals are made, agreements are reached, facts are disclosed. They're not going to tell people. They're not bothered. But also there's classified stuff happening that they're not going to disclose. They're not, and this is a middle class foible that, they're entitled to be told things that are happening. Ask the upper class. They would debate your entitlement to stay alive. They would question that one. The idea, therefore, that the big guns in local affairs or in planning issues or in litigation are going to start chatting to people about what they're doing. They're not going to. They're not going to. They might send out a few messages to steer people off course. I remember when I was teaching in secondary schools, one of the things that I recall was that if there was ever a serious emergency in the school, the management of the school wouldn't tell the teachers, let alone tell the pupils. And if the teachers did find out anything, the management would make sure to steer them off course. That's how leadership works, I'm afraid. That's the way it goes. Things happen, you're not going to be told. Get over it. However neutral Ireland might be, or however much they might want to take stale shamrocks off Micheál Martin in the White House, if the big guns thought that Ireland was going to get in the way of anything that threatened them, they would occupy this country tomorrow. They would do it in a heartbeat and they would gun down anybody who got in the way. Don't have any illusions about that. If America, Russia, or those big guns thought that Ireland was in some way standing in their way, you see how much goodwill this country would get from them. That's why it's debatable that we should be taking a trot position against either Israel or the US or Russia in relation to our proximity to the North Atlantic. Ireland has a military position. It's a strategic position here. Now, as rocketry and as outer space technology improves, that's diminishing. But in the 1950s, during the Cold War, Ireland was of huge strategic importance. Shannon Airport was of huge strategic importance. If the big powers thought for a second that they had to occupy this country, they'd do it tomorrow. Or Britain, or anywhere else. They would do it tomorrow, and you see how much tension there'd be between China, Russia, and the US. They would be together in 2 seconds to do that. So don't be under any illusions. Also, in litigation, getting back to more local affairs, you needn't imagine that the people who are suing one another are necessarily enemies. If they think that there is a joint threat to them, they will join forces very quickly indeed. Litigation in commerce is not like slipping over a banana in a cafe. It's deal making between people who are much more alike than they are apart. And it's the same with the globalists, it's the same with the people who are calling the shots on this planet. They have much more in common than they have apart. Many of them are barking psychopaths, one of the things that they have in common. So they don't care about you. We are all in this together in as much as, and limited to the fact that if an asteroid hit this planet, that would be the end of it. But getting back to that, Ireland has politicians in charge who don't make any decisions. I can tell you that. They don't know what's going on. I can tell you that. They don't know what's going on. So you have the simpleton Varadkar, who's a blabbermouth and who's an attention seeker. I think many of the middle class here are beginning to regret having such a liability basically in control here, but that's their problem. But Varadkar and the RTE ones, they wouldn't have been in on anything that happened over the past 5 days. They wouldn't have been even invited to the ball, I'm afraid. Nobody would tell Varadkar anything. What people have realised, is that Varadkar talks, and he's a big mouth. So nobody would have told Varadkar anything of importance. You don't tell somebody like that those kind of things, because he can't. It's in his condition. You can't blame a pig for grunting, and you cannot blame Varadkar for being Varadkar. Varadkar talks. They call him Leo the Leak, with this mistaken notion of addressing politicians by their first names. Varadkar, though, how would you Varadkar the Vigmouth or whatever? Varadkar the Vole? I don't know how you would find some equally derogatory remark about Varadkar's inability to keep his mouth shut. That's a serious liability in any position of authority, wherever you are, whether you're running a shop, running a school, running a country, running a military, running a global corporation. If you can't keep your mouth shut, you'll be sidelined very, very quickly indeed. They won't tolerate it. They will not tolerate anybody who's a nuisance. They will not tolerate anybody interfering. They will not tolerate anybody who feels that it's okay to talk. It's not okay to talk. Because, let's say this asteroid had been heading for planet Earth, right? And it had got out. Let's say people had heard about it. There would have been global panic. That's not an exaggeration. There would have been global panic. There would have been looting. There would have been rioting. There would have been violence. People would have been running up and out to the streets. It would have been like Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. Except probably a bit more realistically founded, although nothing has happened. Here we are now, it's Monday and everything's okay. Nothing has happened. But if this thing had come closer, there is the real likelihood that they would have launched nuclear rockets to destroy it before it got into the Earth's atmosphere. Those rockets then would have broken it up. The radiation from the rockets would be tuppence halfpenny compared to the radiation that exists beyond the atmosphere anyway, so it wouldn't have been a big deal. But it would appear, if the descriptions of this asteroid are correct, that its size and proximity to Earth was simply unprecedented. You might get that once every 1,000 years skating past planet Earth. Certainly there was a heavy atmosphere. And I noticed on Friday that suddenly the mood lifted. There was a strange feeling that went quite quickly on Friday. That would have been when it was passing over and had gone. Because once it's gone, it's gone. They're not going to chase it. They're going to let it go. So this would explain the logic behind COVID-19. Because it was only ever a flu. My mother said that, it's only a flu. Why are they getting so worked up over it? Because they wanted to have an option of getting the whole planet sitting quietly and sitting tightly. That's what you do in a school. So something happens in the school and you turn to the kids and you say, right, let's open our books and heads down and do writing, please, thanks. You don't say to them something's happened up the corridor. You get them settled down, you get them into their classrooms, you get them writing until whatever has happened has passed. Interestingly, those of us who said they were going to obey the law but not wear masks were left untouched, weren't we? Those who caused trouble and who showed off and video recorded themselves, they're the ones who are getting the court summonses and going to court and all the rest of it. But nothing happened to me. Because one of the things that I communicated was that at all times I would obey the law. So if there's a 5 kilometre lockdown, I was sticking to it, unless I'd got permission to break it. If, I was told to stand outside a supermarket or that kind of thing, I'd do it. I'm not going to break the law. I didn't get into any trouble. And the people who did get into trouble should not imagine, now that this all appears to be receding, They should not imagine that they'll be getting a free pass retrospectively. They won't. They'll be made an example of. They'll be made an example of for being idiots and for taking on the system, you know, with their summonses and their badges and things that they go into shops with. Don't imagine that they'll get a break. They won't. They won't get a break. You know? When you're running a school and you've an emergency in the school and anybody who decides to act up, they'll never be forgiven for that in a critical time. You remember those people. You remember them. You remember them as well as you remember the snitches. And don't imagine also that the big golden lining of, you know, every cloud is a silver lining, that the silver lining of this, in other words, getting the world population locked down, getting people pliable, making them wear masks. Don't imagine that those in charge will, you know, relinquish this if they don't think they have to. You know, I didn't have any trouble. My life wasn't ruined by any of this. But it's the middle class ones, the ones with mortgages and that kind of thing. RTE, although they're not going to get for Radker, they're not going to get a break. Don't imagine they are collateral in this. They are collateral in this. Any sensible politician, but Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar and Simon Harris are not sensible politicians. Any sensible politician in February of last year would have said, I'm now going to become a backbencher and I'm getting out of this. Because what was coming round from February of last year was, by any terms, irrespective of what motivated it, unprecedented. The Wicker Man. Micheál Martin is the Wicker Man. He should not imagine that anybody's going to give him a break. Nor should you think the mainstream media will be reporting the asteroid. I would imagine that they probably will not. It was amateurs, some of whom can be very, very clued in, who mainly blew the whistle on this thing, and it never got into the mainstream media. Possibly there was a classification done that we're not told about. But I do know something. I know that between Wednesday of last week and this morning, I did not hear one plane going in or out of Dublin Airport. I may be wrong, but I know what I heard. So I'll draw my own conclusions.